Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to follow up on yesterday's video about Charles Cotesworth Pinckney with his brother, Thomas Pinckney, who himself is just as, if not more, of an interesting character in the Revolution. Just starting off his life, Thomas Pinckney was brought from his home in South Carolina, which yesterday I believe I said his brother Charles was from Virginia. They weren't, they were from South Carolina. But as a 3-year-old, Thomas is brought from South Carolina to England. And he spends his entire adolescence there until he's 21 years old when he returns to the North American colonies. Which, I don't know what you remember when you were 3 years old. I don't remember much. And I would presume that neither did Thomas Pinckney. But for some reason, he felt a kindredship with the American colonists. And when he came back, he very shortly thereafter joined the Revolution, which is someone who spent his whole life in Britain. You would think he would have sided with the Loyalists, but no, I guess he was better than that, and he wanted to fight with the Patriots, and fight he did. He became an aide-de-camp to General Horatio Gates, who was one of the highest-ranking generals in the Continental Army. Unfortunately, Gates had the disastrous Battle of Camden, where the British just dominated the Americans. It was an embarrassment, and Thomas Pinckney was captured and held as a prisoner of war after that. And Pinckney spent just over a year as a prisoner until around the time the Revolution ended and the British traded him back. And Pinckney says, okay, I'm going to take a break, and he becomes a private citizen for several years. Until 1787, when he is elected to his first ever office, which just happens to be Governor of South Carolina. It's a pretty sweet office to be your first one you're ever elected to. So Pinckney, as Governor of South Carolina, is responsible for calling together the Ratification Convention for the United States Constitution. And he sat as chairman of the South Carolina Ratification Convention, which, as we discussed recently with Nathaniel Gorham, and others, being the chairman of a convention of this nature, you really had a heavy weight of responsibility on your shoulders, because you had to make sure everyone got their say, that one party wasn't overrunning, you know, that the anti-federalists weren't talking too much more than the federalists, or vice versa. You had to make sure cooler heads were prevailing, and, you know, you had to, if you're Thomas Pinckney, get the Constitution ratified, which he successfully did. Shortly thereafter, George Washington becomes president, and so Pinckney is asked by Washington to act as minister to Great Britain. John Adams had been minister to Great Britain, the first one, but then he was elected vice president, and he had to come back to, you know, be vice president. So Thomas Pinckney was chosen to replace John Adams as the second minister to Great Britain, which he did. He went back to the place he had grown up and didn't get a lot done. And the reason for that was, well, the British weren't super happy with the Americans, being that we just threw them off and such. So, unfortunately, he didn't get a ton done, although eventually John Jay, who was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, would come, while Chief Justice, to Great Britain to help Pinckney come to a trade agreement with the British. Now, this became known as the Jay Treaty, which I should make a full video on. Not a lot of people were pumped about it in America, but it did, despite its flaws, help get some of the British out of certain forts and open up certain trading rights. But the question is, if Thomas Pinckney was the one there the whole time, why is it called the Jay Treaty and not the Pinckney Treaty? Great question. And the answer is, there is a Pinckney Treaty, because Pinckney, while he was working as minister to Great Britain, also was an envoy, how do you say it? There's a fancy word for it. He was envoy extraordinary to Spain. Envoy extraordinary. It's very special, apparently. Basically, Washington, while Pinckney was minister to Great Britain, Washington was like, hey, can you hop over to Spain while you're out there? I know you got to go by boat and horse and carriage, but if you could just jump over to Spain and negotiate a treaty with them, which he did. Now, the Pinckney Treaty is also known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and more or less, Spain was very friendly to us during the Revolution. They don't get a lot of credit. When historians talk about the Revolutionary War, you hear a lot of talk about France and the help they gave us, but Spain had all New Spain was the Spanish colonies, and it was everything west of the Mississippi and south, like Florida. So we shared like most of our borders with Spain. And under Bernardo de Galvez, the people of New Spain and the nation of Spain in general actually really helped the Americans win the American Revolutionary War, especially in the South and the West. So we were already friendly, and that was a little easier treaty to make, and basically what the Pinckney Treaty did is it defined the borders between New Spain and the United States of America. After that, Pinckney comes home, and eventually George Washington decides not to run for re-election. So we have John Adams running for president and Thomas Jefferson running for president. But the Federalists who supported Adams did not want Jefferson involved at all. I'll remind you, whoever came in second would be vice president. So since he was from South Carolina and a Federalist, the Federalists put out Thomas Pinckney to run basically with John Adams because they wanted him to be vice president by drawing Southern votes away from Jefferson. Unfortunately, Thomas Pinckney was doing very well, and they became nervous he might beat John Adams. So some of the people who supported Pinckney stopped supporting him to make sure that Adams became president. And because of this, Thomas Jefferson beat Pinckney and became vice president. And I have the stats here. It's incredible because Thomas Pinckney, even though most people don't know his name, he only lost to Jefferson to be vice president by 9 electoral votes. And he only lost the race to be the second president of the United States by 12 votes. Like I said, he was doing too good, and he could have beat Adams if people didn't pull their votes away. So that's more or less where Pinckney's major role in the founding ends. Of course, in the election of 1800, his brother, as we spoke about yesterday, his brother Charles Cotesworth Pinckney would be run with John Adams. And then for the 2 elections, his brother would actually run as the Federalist candidate for president. But this isn't about Charles. We're talking about Thomas today. He more or less resigns. He spends some time in the South Carolina House of Representatives. But then in the War of 1812 breaks out, and he is appointed by President James Madison as a major general in the United States Army. And as a major general, he leads battles mostly in the West, mostly with the Native Americans in the South. We know it, we'll call it the Creek War, usually. It was part of the War of 1812, but kind of a separate war, because down in the South, in Georgia and South Carolina, them and the Creek Nation were butting heads for a century at that point. So we do kind of call it its own war. So that is, you know, his peak is in the 1790s, but here we are 20 years later, and like, I want to say this is how his career resolves, but being appointed a major general is no laughing matter. So this video actually ran a little longer than I anticipated it, but Charles Cotesworth Pinckney is very interesting, and I couldn't help myself. So I'm going to call it for today. If you like this video, please hit like, and if you really liked it, definitely subscribe so you can see my weekday videos I put out here at founderoftheday.com. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you leave them below, and I look forward to talking to you about a different founder tomorrow.